The countdown appeared on every screen in Calder's Hollow at the same moment, unannounced, unrequested, blinking in cold amber digits above a message that gave the colony exactly 12 hours to broadcast a formal surrender before the alien blockade fleet holding position beyond the ridgeline vented the colony's atmosphere into vacuum. And Administrator Marguerite Solano felt, standing in the observation gallery watching those numbers begin their slow, deliberate descent. Something considerably closer to recognition than fear. She had seen this exact shape of threat before. In the files she'd spent years quietly compiling from border colonies that had gone dark under similar circumstances. Colonies whose last transmissions described the same amber countdown, the same 12-hour window, the same carefully engineered pressure designed to do exactly one thing: break the people beneath it before a single shot needed to be fired. 12 hours, said Toby Whitfield, her chief engineer, standing beside her with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular tight line he wore whenever a problem exceeded the boundaries of what wrenches and diagnostic tools could fix. That's not a lot of time to figure out whether they're bluffing. They're not bluffing, Marguerite said. Not about having the capability. Whether they'll actually use it is a different question, and I don't think that question has anything to do with us pleading or panicking in the next 12 hours. Then what does it have to do with? Marguerite watched the countdown continue its patient, mechanical descent, thinking about every file she'd read, every survivor account she'd managed to piece together from colonies that hadn't survived this exact scenario, and felt the old, familiar clarity settle over her that had carried Calder's Hollow through worse than this before. It has to do with whether we give them what they're actually here to collect, she said. And I don't think that's a surrender broadcast, Toby. I think it's data. What Marguerite Solano understood, standing in that observation gallery while 12 hours began ticking down toward a threat she had no way of confirming was genuine, was something that the alien fleet currently surrounding her colony had spent nearly a century and a half refining into an exact, replicable science, though it would be several more hours before she possessed anything close to the full shape of what she was up against. Aboard the Threbian Suzerainty flagship Meridian's Silence, holding position in careful, patient orbit beyond Calder's Hollow's ridgeline, Chief Ethologist Vessyn Thal watched the same countdown from the opposite direction, monitoring a bank of sensor readouts that had, for the past several decades of her career, never once failed to produce the exact behavioral signature she was currently, increasingly, failing to detect. Cortisol analogs remain flat, her research assistant reported, studying the long-range biosensor array trained on the colony below. Adrenal markers within normal baseline range. No elevated heart rate distribution across the sampled population. Ethologist Thal, I don't understand what I'm looking at. According to every model in the Fear Codex, this population should already be showing measurable panic indicators. Vessyn studied the same flat, unremarkable readouts, and felt the particular unsettled curiosity that had defined the most consequential discoveries of her long career. The sense of standing at the edge of an anomaly significant enough to reshape everything she thought she understood about the science she'd spent her life perfecting. Run the diagnostic again, she said, and pull the historical baseline data for every species we've cataloged in the Codex under comparable threat conditions. I want a direct comparison, not an assumption. Ethologist Thal, we've run the diagnostic 6 times. The sensors are functioning correctly. The population simply isn't producing the response. Vessyn did not answer immediately, watching the countdown continue its patient descent on a secondary display, thinking about 140 years of suzerainty behavioral archive, an unbroken record of every subjugated species' predictable collapse under exactly this kind of pressure, and understanding, with the particular electric unease of a scientist confronting the first genuine exception in her entire field's history, that whatever she was looking at down on that quiet, unremarkable colony world, it was not behaving according to any pattern the Fear Codex had ever documented. Then we are looking, she said slowly, at something the Codex has never actually encountered before. Which means, Ren, we need to understand it very carefully and very quickly before Fleet Warden Bane decides the absence of an expected response is itself a form of defiance worth punishing. She did not have long to wait for that concern to prove justified. Fleet Ward. Enkoreth Bane's voice came over the command channel within the hour, carrying the particular clipped impatience of a man who had built his entire career on the reliable, well-documented science Vessyn herself had helped develop, and who did not appreciate discovering, this late into a routine subjugation operation, that the science might not be as reliable as he'd been promised. Ethologist Thal, he said, explain to me why my sensor reports show a target population that isn't afraid. I don't yet have a complete explanation, Fleet Warden, Vessyn admitted. What I have is an anomaly significant enough that I would strongly advise against escalating Protocol 9 until we understand its cause. If this population has developed some manner of psychological or physiological resistance to standard pressure conditioning, destroying them without first documenting how would represent an extraordinary loss of scientific value. Scientific value, Bane repeated, and Vessyn could hear, even through the flattened translation of the command channel, the particular scorn of a military officer who had never fully trusted the behavioral sciences division's insistence that understanding a population mattered as much as controlling it. I did not bring my fleet across 4 systems to conduct a research expedition, ethologist. I brought it here to secure a strategically valuable mining colony with minimal resource expenditure, which Protocol 9 has accomplished successfully on every comparable target for the past 40 years. If this population refuses to respond appropriately within the allotted window, we proceed exactly as the protocol specifies. Fleet Warden, I would ask for additional observation time before. You have your 12 hours, ethologist, Bane said. The same 12 hours the protocol allots every target. I see no reason to extend special consideration to this particular colony simply because your sensors are producing readings you find personally interesting. The channel closed before Vessyn could offer any further argument, and she stood for a long moment in the quiet hum of her research station, watching the countdown continue its steady descent, understanding that she had somewhere close to 11 hours remaining to solve a mystery that a century and a half of accumulated behavioral science had left her almost entirely unprepared to approach. Down on Calder's Hollow, Marguerite Solana was, at that exact moment, doing something considerably simpler than anything Vessyn's instruments were equipped to properly measure. She was making tea. You're making tea, Toby said, following her into the colony's central common hall, where several dozen colonists had gathered in the quiet, unhurried way of people settling in for a long wait rather than bracing for imminent catastrophe. Marguerite, there's an alien fleet outside our atmosphere threatening to vent us into space in 12 hours, and you're making tea. I'm making tea, Marguerite agreed, because in 11 hours and 50 minutes, this colony is either going to still be here or it isn't, and either way I intend to spend the time in between doing something useful with my hands instead of staring at a countdown I have no power to stop. She glanced at him, something calm and steady in her expression that Toby had learned, across the 8 years he'd served under her administration, to trust more than almost anything else in his professional life. Get the others settled, pull out the emergency supply rotations. We're not panicking, Toby. We survived worse than a countdown once already, and I intend for us to survive this the exact same way. The worse Marguerite was referring to, and the reason Calder's Hollow's response to Protocol 9 so thoroughly confounded a century and a half of suzerainty behavioral data, had happened 11 years earlier, in an engineering catastrophe that had nearly ended the colony's existence long before any alien fleet ever arrived to threaten it. Calder's Hollow had been built around a deep-crust mining operation, its habitat modules dependent on a single primary atmospheric processor that 11 years earlier had suffered a catastrophic containment failure during a routine maintenance cycle. triggering an emergency exactly as dire as the one currently facing the colony. An 18-hour window before backup reserves ran out entirely. No functioning replacement processor within reach. And a population of 1,100 people who had, by every reasonable expectation, every right to descend into exactly the kind of panic the Suzerainty's Fear Codex predicted for populations under comparable pressure. They had not descended into panic. Marguerite, then a junior administrator only recently promoted into emergency leadership after her predecessor's sudden medical incapacitation, had instead organized the colony into careful, deliberate rotations, rationing what breathable air remained with the same calm. Methodical patience she had just now applied to making tea, keeping the colony's children occupied with stories and games specifically designed to make the waiting feel purposeful rather than desperate, and had 18 hours later watched a jury-rigged backup processor assembled from scavenged parts and 11 straight hours of exhausted engineering work finally restore breathable atmosphere with less than 40 minutes of reserve remaining. "We already know what the end of the countdown feels like," she told the assembled colonists now, standing at the front of the common hall with the same steady authority that had carried them through that earlier crisis. "We've stood at the edge of it before and we came back from it, not because we panicked our way through, but because we stayed steady and trusted each other and did the next necessary thing without wasting energy imagining every way it might go wrong. I don't know if this fleet outside is bluffing. I don't know if they'll actually vent this colony in 12 hours, or if that's simply a threat meant to break us into surrendering before it ever comes to that. What I do know is that whatever happens, we are not going to spend the next 11 hours and 40 minutes handing them the one thing I suspect they actually came here to collect, which is proof that fear works on us the same way it apparently works on everyone else they've ever done this to. If this story has already got its hooks in you the way I think it might, take a second to hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me whether you think the fleet above Calder's Hollow is actually going to pull the trigger, or whether this whole thing is a bluff designed to break them before it ever has to. Because 11 hours out from that deadline, even the aliens running this operation aren't entirely sure anymore which one it's going to be. Vessyn Thal spent the following 3 hours doing something she had not done in the better part of 2 decades of behavioral research. She abandoned her instruments entirely and simply watched, unfiltered, unmediated by sensor overlays and predictive models. The raw footage her long-range observation platforms had been quietly gathering from Calder's Hollow's public gathering spaces. What she saw did not match anything in the Fear Codex's extensive catalog of subjugated population behaviors under comparable pressure. She saw colonists distributing ration supplies with careful, practiced efficiency. No hoarding, no visible competition for resources despite an uncertain and potentially catastrophic timeline. She saw small groups of children being led through structured activities by adults who showed no outward sign of the desperate, barely contained fear the Codex's models predicted should be present in caregivers attempting to shield their young from an existential threat. She saw, most confounding of all, small clusters of colonists simply talking quietly, unhurriedly, in a manner that her translation algorithms, straining to parse the specific content, eventually identified as storytelling, an oral tradition of shared narrative that appeared to be functioning as a deliberate, structured coping mechanism rather than a symptom of denial. "They're not suppressing fear," she said aloud, mostly to herself, working through the implications in real time. "The Codex assumes every population under threat experiences fear and either expresses it or suppresses it, and we've built our entire predictive model around measuring which populations do which. But this population isn't doing either. There's no elevated baseline to suppress. They're behaving as though the threat, while real, simply isn't the most important variable currently occupying their attention." "With respect, ethologist," her research assistant said, "that seems functionally impossible. Every documented sentient species experiences measurable fear responses to existential threat. It's one of the few genuinely universal constants across the entire codex. I agree that fear itself is universal, Vessyn said slowly, working through an idea that felt, even as she articulated it, like the edge of something considerably larger than the immediate crisis facing Calder's Hollow. I no longer agree that our model correctly understands what happens after fear registers. We've spent 140 years studying how quickly populations break under pressure, Ren. I don't think we've ever seriously studied what happens in populations that have already, at some earlier point, made peace with the worst outcome before the pressure ever arrived. I think that's what we're looking at down there, not an absence of fear. A prior reckoning with it, thorough enough that this particular threat no longer has fresh ground to work with. She thought, unbidden, of something she had not allowed herself to consider in a very long time. A fragment of her own species' distant history that every Threbian child learned in careful, sanitized form during their earliest schooling. The collapsed centuries, 300 years buried deep in suzerainty prehistory when her ancestors had been the ones subjugated, broken not through direct conquest but through the patient, systematic exploitation of their own fear by a rival power whose name had been deliberately, thoroughly erased from every surviving record specifically so no descendant of the survivors would ever have to carry the shame of remembering it. The Fear Codex itself, Vessyn understood with a clarity that unsettled her more than she was prepared to admit, had been built in direct response to that ancient trauma, an institution founded by survivors determined that the suzerainty would never again be the population on the receiving end of exactly this kind of pressure. That understanding fear so completely, so scientifically, so thoroughly that it could be deployed with surgical precision against others, would guarantee that vulnerability could never again be turned against them the way it once had been. She remembered, with a specificity she had not allowed herself in years, the single surviving fragment of testimony her own grandmother had passed down from the final generation to actually live through the collapse. A fragment so carefully guarded within her family that Vessyn had heard it only once as a child, and had never been permitted to ask about it again. Her grandmother had described the sound of an entire city choosing, collectively and without any single moment of decision, to stop trusting itself. Neighbors reporting neighbors to the occupying power in exchange for small mercies that were rarely honored. Families fracturing under pressure that never even needed to escalate into direct violence, because the fear alone had done all the necessary work. The occupying power, whoever they had been, had understood something about Threbian psychology that Vessyn's own ancestors had not yet understood about themselves. And it had taken scarcely 3 years to reduce a civilization to rubble without ever needing to fire more than a token number of shots. When the suzerainty finally reclaimed its independence, generations later, it had done so with a single, unshakable resolution etched into the foundation of its new government. Never again would ignorance of fear's mechanics leave them vulnerable to exactly that kind of quiet, bloodless conquest. They had never once, in 140 years of increasingly sophisticated research, thought to study what might have happened to their own ancestors if patience, rather than merely the eventual hard-won resistance to fear, had been available to them from the beginning. Ethologist Thal, her research assistant, said carefully, watching her expression shift through something that looked considerably more personal than professional curiosity. "Are you all right?" "I'm not certain," Vessyn admitted. "I believe I may be looking at something our own history should have prepared me to recognize considerably sooner than it has." Fleet Warden Bain's patience, meanwhile, was running considerably shorter than the colonies below, and 6 hours into the 12-hour countdown, he ordered the first escalation Vessyn had been dreading, a demonstration strike against one of the colony's unoccupied outer mining platforms. Close enough to be seen and felt from the habitat modules, distant enough to avoid immediate casualties, calibrated precisely, according to 140 years of accumulated data. To shatter whatever fragile composure a target population had managed to maintain through the earlier hours of psychological pressure. The strike landed exactly as planned, a controlled detonation that lit the horizon beyond Calder's Hollow's ridge line in brief, violent orange light. And Vessyn watched her sensor readouts with the particular held breath of a scientist awaiting confirmation of a hypothesis she both wanted and dreaded to see proven correct. The population's baseline readings shifted, finally, for the first time since the countdown began, a measurable spike in stress indicators rippling across the sampled colonists. And for a brief moment, Vessyn allowed herself to believe the Codex's predictive models had simply needed more time to assert themselves after all. Then the readings settled, far more quickly and far more completely than any comparable population in the Codex's extensive archive had ever managed, returning within minutes to something close to the same flat, steady baseline that had confounded her sensors since the crisis began. They felt it, her research assistant said slowly, studying the data. The spike is real, but they recovered from it almost immediately. That's not resistance to fear, ethologist. That's something considerably more sophisticated. That's regulation. Down in Calder's Hollow's common hall, Marguerite Solano had felt the demonstration strike as a distant tremor through the habitat module's deck plating, had watched, along with every colonist gathered around her, the brief flare of violent light through the gallery's reinforced viewport, and had understood in the same instant exactly what the aliens above were attempting to accomplish. That was a message, she said, into the tense, momentary silence that followed the tremor. Not an attack. If they wanted to hurt us, they'd have hit something occupied. They hit an empty platform specifically to scare us without actually costing us anything material. That's not the action of people confident enough in their threat to simply follow through on it. That's the action of people hoping fear alone will finish the job before they have to. How can you be so sure? Asked one of the younger colonists. A woman named Dio Petrakis, who had joined the colony's engineering staff only 2 years earlier and had never experienced the earlier atmospheric crisis that had shaped so much of the community's collective resilience. I can't be entirely sure, Marguerite admitted honestly, but I've spent years reading everything I could find about colonies that faced this exact kind of pressure and didn't survive it, and every single account describes populations that broke because they let the fear of what might happen next consume all their attention, right up until the moment it actually did. We're not going to make that mistake, Dio. We're going to keep doing exactly what we've been doing. We're going to breathe and ration and wait and trust each other, because that strategy has already saved this colony once before, and I have no intention of abandoning it now just because the threat this time happens to be wearing a different face. Dio nodded slowly, some of the tension visibly easing from her shoulders, and Marguerite understood, watching that small, quiet shift ripple outward through the rest of the gathered colonists, that the demonstration strike had accomplished the opposite of what its architects intended. It had given the community something concrete to have survived together, a shared moment of held breath and collective steadiness that reinforced, rather than undermined, exactly the resilience the aliens had been hoping to shatter. It was not, however, entirely true that no one in Calder's Hollow came close to breaking, and Marguerite found Dio alone in a maintenance corridor an hour later, sitting with her back against a bulkhead and her knees drawn up to her chest, shaking in the particular silent, controlled way of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. I couldn't do it in there, Dio said, when Marguerite crouched down beside her without a word of judgment in her expression. Everyone else looked so calm, and I just kept thinking about my parents back on the second ring settlement and whether they even know what's happening out here, and I couldn't keep pretending I was fine in front of everyone. You don't have to be fine in front of everyone, Marguerite said quietly. You have to be fine in front of yourself eventually, and even that doesn't have to happen all at once. Nobody in that hall is actually as calm as they look, Dio. They've just had longer practice at letting the fear sit next to them instead of in the driver's seat. That's not a switch you flip. It's something you build one hard hour at a time, and you're allowed to still be building it. What if I can't? Dio asked. What if I'm just not built the way the rest of you are? Marguerite settled onto the deck beside her, in no visible hurry to be anywhere else. 11 years ago, during the processor failure, I spent the first 2 hours of that crisis exactly where you're sitting right now, she said. Hiding in a supply closet, certain I was about to watch this entire colony die on my first real day in charge of anything. Nobody tells you that part of the story because it doesn't feel like the kind of thing worth repeating. But it's the truest part, Dio. I didn't walk into that crisis already calm. I found the calm somewhere in the middle of it, mostly by deciding over and over in each individual minute that I'd rather spend my fear on being useful than on being afraid. You can decide that too, right now if you want. Nobody's going to think less of you for how long it took you to get there. Dio was quiet for a long moment and then slowly uncurled from around her knees, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Okay, she said. Okay, what do you need me to do? Right now, just breathe with me for a minute, Marguerite said. Then, when you're ready, come help me with the ration rotations. Having something useful for your hands helps more than anything I can say. They sat together for a while longer in the quiet corridor, and when they finally returned to the common hall, Dio moved through the ration distribution with hands that had stopped shaking, not because the fear had vanished entirely, but because she ate. Tad in that narrow maintenance corridor made exactly the same quiet decision the rest of the colony had made years earlier, one useful minute at a time. In the corner of the common hall, away from the main gathering, an older colonist named Fenadair had settled onto a low bench with a cluster of children around him, and had begun in the low, unhurried cadence of someone who had told this particular story more times than he could count, recounting the tale of the original processor failure 11 years earlier, not as a lesson in danger, but as a story about a colony that had once been frightened and had found its way through anyway. Dio drifted toward the edge of that circle, drawn by something she couldn't quite name, and found herself listening as Fen described the exhausted engineers who had rebuilt the backup processor from scavenged parts, the children who had been kept occupied with games specifically invented for that crisis and had been played at every colony gathering since, the particular deliberate ritual of naming, out loud, everyone who had contributed even a small part to the colony's survival. So that the story never belonged to any single hero, but to the whole community that had carried it together. Why do you tell it now? Dio asked quietly, once the children had wandered off to repeat fragments of the story to each other in the delighted, half-garbled way children retold things they loved. With everything happening outside. Because it's exactly the moment the story is for, Fen said. We didn't build this story to entertain ourselves on quiet evenings, Dio, though we do that too. We built it so that when a day like today eventually arrived, and Marguerite always told us one eventually would, in one shape or another, we wouldn't have to invent our courage from nothing. We'd just have to remember we'd already found it once and reach for the same thing again. Dio sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in her own chest, tight and anxious since the countdown first appeared, loosened by careful degrees. I've only been here 2 years, she said. I wasn't part of that story. You're part of this one, Fen said simply, and returned to his tea, unhurried, as though the alien fleet beyond the ridge line were simply whether to be waited out rather than an executioner counting down the hours. Vessyn requested, and after considerable argument received, a brief audience with Fleet Warden Bane in the 6 hours remaining before the countdown's conclusion, standing before his command station aboard the Meridian's silence with the full weight of her research prepared, and she suspected, considerably less time than she actually needed to make her case persuasively. The demonstration strike did not produce the expected outcome, she said. Stress indicators spiked briefly and then returned to baseline faster than any comparable population in the Codex's entire archive. Fleet Warden, this population is not failing to experience fear. They are actively, collectively regulating it in a manner our science has never previously documented in any subjugated species. I believe this represents a discovery of considerable strategic and scientific significance, and I am asking you formally to suspend Protocol 9's escalation, until we understand the mechanism well enough to determine whether it represents an isolated anomaly or a trait broadly present across the entire human species. Bain studied her for a long moment, and Vessyn watched something calculating shift behind his expression, the particular careful reassessment of a military commander weighing the cost of an unexpected variable against the cost of admitting his operation had not proceeded according to plan. If this trait is present broadly across their species, he said slowly, that would represent a considerably more significant strategic problem than a single stubborn mining colony ethologist. It would mean Protocol 9 and every strategy built on the assumption that fear conditioning eventually breaks any target population might not function reliably against human populations at all. Yes, Vessyn said, which is precisely why I believe destroying this colony without fully understanding what we're looking at would represent an extraordinary strategic failure, not merely a scientific one. If humans as a species have developed some manner of collective resilience to exactly the pressure our entire subjugation doctrine depends on, the suzerainty needs to understand that mechanism considerably more urgently than it needs to secure one mining colony's resources on schedule. Bain was silent for a long moment, and Vessyn understood, watching him weigh her argument against 140 years of institutional confidence in a doctrine that had never once failed this dramatically, that she was asking him to accept something considerably more uncomfortable than a delayed timeline. She was asking him to accept that the foundation of suzerainty military doctrine, the hard-won certainty built from the ashes of their own ancestors' historical trauma, might contain a blind spot large enough to swallow every assumption it had ever generated. "You have 3 additional hours," he said finally. "Not because I am persuaded by your theory, ethologist, but because if you are correct, I would rather discover that fact through careful observation than through the considerably more costly method of finding out in the middle of an actual invasion campaign. Use the time well. If the population's readings have not conclusively demonstrated something the Codex cannot already explain by the time the original countdown expires, Protocol 9 proceeds exactly as designed." Vessyn returned to her research station with 3 additional hours and the uncomfortable understanding that she had just staked her entire professional credibility, and possibly the survival of an entire human colony, on her ability to prove a hypothesis that ran directly counter to a century and a half of accumulated institutional certainty. She spent the first of those 3 hours doing something she suspected no Threbian ethologist had ever seriously attempted in the entire history of the Fear Codex's development. She opened a direct communication channel to the colony itself, requesting, through careful, deliberately non-threatening translation protocols, to speak with whoever currently held administrative authority over Calder's Hollow. Marguerite accepted the channel with the same steady composure she had maintained through every hour of the crisis so far, though Vessyn noted, studying the human woman's expression through the transmission, something that might have been cautious curiosity beneath the calm. "I understand you're the one running the study," Marguerite said, before Vessyn had fully composed her opening question. "The behavioral one. The reason we're still getting demonstration strikes instead of an actual atmospheric venting 6 hours past your original deadline." Vessyn felt a flicker of something close to admiration at the accuracy of the human's assessment. "You are correct, Administrator. My name is Vessyn Thal. I am the Chief Ethologist responsible for the behavioral protocol currently being applied to your colony, and I will be direct with you, because I suspect very little would be gained by attempting otherwise with someone who has clearly already deduced the shape of what's happening. I do not fully understand why your population is not responding to this pressure the way every other population in our extensive historical archive has responded. I am asking you directly to help me understand it, because I believe the answer may determine whether this operation concludes with your colony's survival or its destruction." Marguerite was quiet for a long moment, Studying the alien face on her display with an expression Vessyn found difficult to fully parse through the imperfect medium of translated communication, though something in the human's posture suggested careful, deliberate consideration rather than either hostility or desperate hope. "You want to know why we're not afraid," Marguerite said finally. "I want to know why your fear response, which our sensors have confirmed does exist, does not appear to accumulate or overwhelm your collective decision-making the way it does in every other population we've studied," Vessyn said. "I am asking, Administrator, because I believe my own people once faced something very similar to what you are currently experiencing, a long time ago, and I do not believe we survived it nearly as well as your colony currently appears to be surviving this." Something shifted in Marguerite's expression at that admission, a softening that Vessyn suspected had less to do with sympathy and more to do with the particular recognition of one wary survivor identifying another. "We're not fearless," Marguerite said. "I want to be very clear about that, Ethologist Thal, because I think that's the mistake your protocol keeps making. We felt that demonstration strike exactly as much as you probably hoped we would. Every person in this colony has spent the last several hours quietly terrified underneath whatever calm you're currently measuring. The difference isn't that we don't feel it. The difference is that we made a decision, collectively, a long time before your fleet ever arrived, about what we were going to do with that fear once it showed up." "What decision?" Vessyn asked. "That fear gets to visit," Marguerite said. "It doesn't get to drive. We learned that the hard way 11 years ago in a crisis that had nothing to do with your fleet and everything to do with our own colony's engineering failing us when we needed it most. We learned that panic wastes exactly the resources you need most in an emergency, clear thinking and steady hands, and the ability to trust the person standing next to you instead of turning on them the moment things get frightening. So we built habits deliberately, patiently over years, specifically so that the next time something threatened us, and we always assumed something eventually would, we wouldn't have to figure out how to stay calm in the middle of the crisis itself. We'd already have practiced it long before the crisis ever arrived." Vessyn sat with that answer for a long moment, feeling the shape of it settle into place alongside everything her sensors had been struggling to explain for the past 9 hours, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically uncomfortable, exactly what her own species' history had failed to give them in the aftermath of the collapsed centuries. "You practiced patience," she said slowly, "the way my people practiced vigilance, as a deliberate response to trauma cultivated over years until it became instinct rather than effort." "Something like that," Marguerite agreed. "Though I'd guess from the way you're saying it that this isn't purely academic curiosity for you, Ethologist Thal." Vessyn was quiet for a moment, weighing how much of her own species' history was appropriate to share with a human administrator whose colony her own fleet was, even now, still threatening to destroy. "My species survived something considerably similar to what your colony is currently experiencing several centuries ago," she said finally. "We did not survive it as gracefully as your people appear to be managing. We survived it broken, Administrator, and we spent the centuries since building an entire scientific discipline around making certain we would never again be caught unprepared for fear, without ever once considering that the actual lesson we should have learned was how to be unprepared for panic instead." Marguerite studied her for a long moment, and something in the human's expression shifted again, softening further into what Vessyn recognized, even across the considerable gap of species and circumstance separating them, as genuine, unguarded empathy. "I'm sorry that happened to your people," she said. "Genuinely, I don't say that as a strategy ethologist Thal. I say it because I know what it costs a community to survive something like that, even when the surviving itself goes considerably better than it apparently did for yours." Something in that simple, unguarded kindness, offered by a woman whose entire colony still hung under active threat of destruction, struck Vessyn with a force she had not anticipated and was not entirely certain how to process within the professional framework her career had spent decades constructing. 3 hours remain in the extension Fleet Warden Bane granted me, she said finally. I would like to use that time, Administrator, to understand considerably more than my sensors have been able to measure, not for the purposes of refining Protocol 9. I no longer believe Protocol 9, or the entire doctrine it represents, deserves refining. I believe it deserves to be reconsidered entirely, and I do not believe I can make that argument to my superiors without understanding, as completely as you're willing to share it, exactly what your colony built in the years since your own crisis that mine never managed to build in the centuries since ours. The 3 hours that followed unfolded not as an interrogation, but as something closer to a genuine exchange, Marguerite walking Vessyn through the specific, deliberate practices Calder's Hollow had cultivated in the years since its own near catastrophe. The structured rotations, the shared storytelling traditions, the careful cultivation of trust between neighbors long before any crisis demanded it, while Vessyn, in turn, found herself sharing fragments of Threbian history she had never before discussed with anyone outside her own species. The collapsed centuries, the founding of the Fear Codex, the slow, institutional calcification of vigilance into something that had eventually curdled into exactly the kind of doctrine now threatening to destroy a colony that had done nothing wrong except demonstrate, simply by remaining calm, that an alternative had always been possible. I have a question, Marguerite said, near the end of their 3 hours, and I want you to understand I'm not asking it to be cruel. I'm asking because I think it matters for whatever happens next. Do you actually believe destroying this colony would accomplish anything your suzerainty needs, Ethologist Thal? Or do you believe, the way I suspect you do, that it would simply be your fleet warden protecting a doctrine that's just been proven considerably less reliable than he's comfortable admitting? Vessyn did not answer immediately, weighing the question with the same careful honesty she had been extending throughout their entire exchange. I believe, she said finally, that Fleet Warden Bane's doctrine has never once in 140 years encountered a population it could not eventually break. I believe that failure, more than any strategic calculation about your colony's mining resources, is what actually threatens to drive his decision in the hours ahead. And I believe, Administrator, that if I cannot find a way to make my own people understand what your colony has just demonstrated, this will not be the last human population to face exactly what you're currently facing. It will simply be the first. The final hour of the extended countdown arrived with Fleet Warden Bane's patience exhausted entirely, and Vessyn found herself standing once more before his command station, this time not merely to request additional time, but to make the argument she had spent the preceding hours carefully assembling, an argument built not on sensor data alone, but on the considerably more difficult foundation of institutional history her own species had spent centuries avoiding. The Codex has never encountered this trait, she said, because the Codex was built by survivors of the collapsed centuries specifically to prevent our own vulnerability from ever being exploited again, and in building it we made an assumption none of us ever thought to question. We assumed vigilance against fear and resistance to fear were the same skill. They are not Fleet Warden. Vigilance watches for the threat. Patience decides in advance how you intend to meet it once it arrives. Our ancestors developed the first without ever developing the second, and we have spent 140 years building an entire military doctrine on that same incomplete foundation, weaponizing exactly the vulnerability we should have spent that time learning how to heal in ourselves. Bane's expression, as she spoke, carried none of the dismissive impatience she had encountered in their earlier exchange, replaced instead by something considerably more unsettled, the particular stillness of a man confronting an argument he did not want to accept but could not immediately refute. He was quiet long enough that Vessyn wondered if she had misjudged him entirely, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not expected from a man whose entire career she had known primarily through the clipped efficiency of command directives. My own grandfather served in the reclamation campaigns that finally ended the collapse, he said slowly. He used to tell me when I was young enough to still ask him about it, that the hardest part of those campaigns was never the fighting. It was learning to trust anyone again, afterward, because the occupation had taught an entire generation that trust was the single most dangerous thing a person could offer another. I built my career on making certain no enemy of the suzerainty could ever again exploit that particular wound. I did not build it, ethologist, expecting to discover that the wound itself might still be shaping decisions 140 years later, in ways none of us thought to examine. I don't believe you built Protocol 9 out of cruelty, Fleet Warden, Vessyn said quietly. I believe you built it the way the entire Codex was built, out of a determination that our people would never again be caught the way your grandfather's generation was caught. I simply believe that determination, however understandable, however earned, may have taught us the wrong lesson from the right grief. You are asking me, he said slowly, to believe that our entire subjugation doctrine, the foundation of suzerainty military strategy for 140 years, is built on an incomplete understanding of the very trauma it was designed to prevent from recurring. I am asking you to believe, Vessyn said, that the population currently under threat below us has just demonstrated, without firing a single shot or issuing a single act of defiance, something our own ancestors never had the chance to learn in time to save themselves. I am asking you to consider, Fleet Warden, whether destroying the only population we have ever encountered that might actually be capable of teaching us that lesson serves the suzerainty's genuine long-term interests, or whether it simply protects a doctrine too many careers, including possibly both of ours, have been built upon defending. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Vessyn began to wonder whether she had finally, irreversibly overstepped the careful professional boundaries that had defined her entire relationship with military command throughout her career. And when Bane finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight considerably different from the clipped, confident authority he had held at the beginning of the operation. I have spent my entire career, he said slowly, trusting that the Codex represented the accumulated wisdom of everything our species learned from its darkest historical failure. I do not know how to simply set that trust aside because one anomalous colony has produced sensor readings I cannot immediately expel. Ain, he paused, and something in his expression shifted, the careful, deliberate reassessment of a man weighing decades of institutional certainty against the discomfort of a single, persuasive counterargument. But I have also built my career on the principle that a commander who refuses to adjust strategy in the face of clear contradicting evidence is not exercising discipline. He is exercising cowardice dressed in the language of doctrine. Protocol 9 is suspended, Ethologist Thal, pending a full review by Suzerainty Behavioral Command. This fleet will withdraw to standard patrol distance, and you will have whatever additional time and resources you require to properly document what you found here. Because if you are even partially correct about what this means, I would rather my career end for having paused too cautiously than for having destroyed something none of us yet understand. Vessyn felt something in her chest loosen that she had not realized, until that exact moment, had been held rigid with tension since the moment her sensors first failed to produce the readings she had spent her entire career learning to expect. "Thank you, Fleet Warden," she said quietly. "Do not thank me yet," Bane said. "You have made a considerably larger argument than a single colony's survival, ethologist. If Suzerainty Command agrees with your assessment, this will not simply mean sparing one mining settlement. It will mean reconsidering 140 years of military doctrine, and I suspect that process will be considerably less comfortable for all of us than anything that has happened here today." Down in Calder's Hollow, Marguerite Solano watched the countdown on the observation gallery's display finally, impossibly, stop, freezing at just under 2 hours remaining before its original deadline, replaced by a message that took her several long moments to fully process. A formal notice of protocol suspension, delivered not in the cold, clinical language of the earlier threat, but in careful, deliberately respectful phrasing that felt, even filtered through translation software never designed for warmth, unmistakably sincere. "They're pulling back," Toby said, staring at the same display with an expression somewhere between disbelief and cautious, unwilling hope. Marguerite, they're actually pulling back. Marguerite allowed herself, for the first time in nearly 12 hours, a long, unsteady breath, watching the fleet's tactical signature on the secondary display begin its slow withdrawal to a considerably more distant orbit. "Get everyone gathered in the common hall," she said. "Not to celebrate yet. Just to breathe together properly now that we're actually allowed to." Vessyn requested, and this time received without hesitation, a second direct channel to Marguerite's administrative station within the hour. And when the human woman's face appeared once more on her display, Vessyn saw something in her expression that had not been present during their earlier exchange. The particular cautious relief of someone who had spent 12 hours holding steady against a threat that had, against every historical precedent, finally chosen to withdraw. "Fleet Warden Bane has suspended the operation," Vessyn said, "pending full review by Suzerainty Behavioral Command. I want to be honest with you, Administrator, about what that means. It does not guarantee your colony's permanent safety. It means that what happened here today has become significant enough that the decision about your colony's future is no longer being made by a single fleet commander acting on established doctrine. It is being escalated to people who will need to seriously reconsider that doctrine before they decide anything further." "That's more than I expected 12 hours ago," Marguerite admitted. "I won't pretend it doesn't still leave a considerable amount uncertain." "It does," Vessyn agreed. "I would like if you are willing to continue what we began during the extension Bane granted me. Not as an extension of Protocol 9's observation, but as something considerably more honest. I believe your colony has learned something my own species spent centuries failing to learn after our own darkest hour. And I believe that lesson deserves considerably more careful, considerably more respectful study than anything the Fear Codex was ever built to provide." Marguerite considered that for a long moment, studying the alien face on her display with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the preceding hours, from wary calculation into something closer to genuine, cautious openness. "I think," she said finally, "that would require you to actually visit us, Ethologist Thal, properly. Not through sensors trained on us from orbit. I don't think patience is something you can measure from a distance. I think it's something you have to actually sit inside of, with the people who practice it, long enough to understand why it works." "Well, Vesey." N felt something settle into place at that answer. A recognition of exactly the kind of careful, deliberate patience Marguerite had just spent 12 hours demonstrating, extended now as an invitation rather than a demand. "I would like that very much," she said. The formal review that followed Vessyn's report to Suzerainty Behavioral Command unfolded over the following months with a slowness that would have felt, to anyone less accustomed to institutional processes, almost unbearably protracted. But that Marguerite watching updates arrive through the careful, evolving diplomatic channel Vessyn had established between Calder's Hollow and the wider Suzerainty government. Recognized as its own particular form of the exact patience, she had spent years teaching her own colony to practice. The review's conclusions, once finally published, rippled considerably further than Calder's Hollow's single ridge line. 3 other border colonies, human settlements that had been quietly scheduled for their own eventual Protocol 9 operations, were removed from that list entirely, their case files reclassified under the same new behavioral heading Vessyn had fought to establish. Fleet Warden Bane, rather than facing the disciplinary consequences he had privately expected for suspending a sanctioned operation, found himself instead reassigned to lead a newly formed liaison division tasked with reevaluating decades of subjugation doctrine across every species in the suzerainty's extensive historical archive. A reassignment he described to Vessyn in one of their increasingly candid exchanges as considerably more uncomfortable than any battlefield command he had held in 30 years of service, and considerably more necessary. "I keep thinking about how close it came," he admitted to her during one such exchange, "to simply proceeding as designed. If you had not pushed as hard as you did, Ethologist, in those first hours, I would have followed the countdown exactly as written, and I would have gone the rest of my career believing I had done nothing wrong." You did not in the end, Vessyn said. That's the part I find myself returning to, Fleet Warden. Not that the doctrine failed, but that when it did, you were willing to let it fail rather than force the outcome it was built to guarantee. Vessyn visited Calder's Hollow in person 4 months after the countdown's suspension, standing for the first time in the same common hall where Marguerite had once made tea while waiting to learn whether her colony would survive the day, and found herself watching the ordinary, unhurried rhythm of colonists going about lives that had, against every historical precedent her species possessed, refused to be reshaped by fear. Understanding something about her own people's ancient trauma that 140 years of increasingly sophisticated research had never once managed to teach her. Fenadair was there in the corner of the hall, telling the same story of the processor failure to a new cluster of children, several of whom Marguerite mentioned quietly as they passed, had not even been born the first time the story was told, and Vessyn found herself lingering at the edge of that circle for longer than she had intended, listening to the unhurried cadence of a story deliberately built to outlast the crisis it commemorated, understanding, in a way her sensors never could have measured, exactly what Marguerite had meant about patience being something you had to sit inside of rather than observe from a distance. We have a version of that, she admitted, when Marguerite found her still standing there some time later. Stories, I mean. Every Threbian child is taught the history of the collapsed centuries, taught to recite the dates and the losses and the eventual reclamation of independence. I do not believe we have ever once taught it as your colonist just taught his children that story, as something that belonged to the community rather than a single tragedy to be memorized and feared. I wonder now how much of my own species' difficulty with patience traces back to exactly that difference. It's not too late to change how you tell it, Marguerite said. Stories can be retold, Ethologist Thal, that's rather the point of them. The Fear Codex is being amended, Vessyn told her later, standing together in the observation gallery where this entire encounter had begun, watching the same stars that had once carried an alien fleet's threat now simply continuing their slow, ordinary wheel overhead. For the first time in its entire history, there is a new entry, Administrator, under a heading that did not previously exist within the entire archive. Patience as a distinct trait from fear resistance, cultivated deliberately over time through practiced trust rather than mere vigilance. It is, I am told, generating considerable discomfort among certain factions of Suzerainty Command who built their entire careers on the doctrine. This discovery is currently unraveling. Discomfort sounds like progress in my experience, Marguerite said. The comfortable version of an institution rarely changes anything that actually needs changing. Vessyn allowed herself something she suspected, watching her own reflection faintly overlaid against the viewport's dark glass, might have been the first genuine smile she had permitted herself in longer than she cared to calculate. I find, Administrator, that I am beginning to agree with you rather more often than my earlier career would have predicted. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars continue their patient, indifferent wheel above a colony that had 12 hours and then 4 months and then, Vessyn suspected, considerably longer still, quietly proven something far larger than either of them had initially understood was at stake. That fear, however universal, however deeply embedded in the architecture of every sentient species that had ever faced existential threat, did not have to be the final word in how a community chose to meet its darkest hour. They studied us for decades, Marguerite said eventually, something quiet and reflective in her voice. Fear, specifically, how to find it, how to measure it, how to use it. I imagine that felt like thorough research from where you were standing. It was thorough, Vessyn agreed. It was also, I have come to understand, considerably incomplete. They never once asked about patience, Marguerite said. Never wondered what happens in the years before the crisis when nobody's watching, when a community is simply deciding quietly and without any audience at all what kind of people it wants to be when the worst finally arrives. She looked at Vessyn, something warm and unguarded in her expression. I think that's probably where you'll find whatever you're actually looking for, Ethologist Thal, not in the moment of the threat. It's in all the ordinary, unremarkable hours that come long before it. Vessyn considered that, watching the stars, thinking about 140 years of accumulated fear data that had never once thought to ask the question Marguerite had just so simply articulated, and understood with a clarity that felt less like professional insight and more like something considerably closer to hope, that her own species, given enough patience of its own, might yet learn to ask it too.